Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Benigno.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Buenos dias.
Good
Buenos
morning.
dias.
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Thank
Good
you.
morning.
Buenos
dias.
It's flown by.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Buongiorno.
Good morning.
Buenos dias.
Friends, today we have different marching orders through the desert, hopefully out. I'd like to start by reminding you that we will not go out into rooms today. I will ask the Spirit to release me as soon as possible, and then we will go into open worship. I have my elders. They will hold me. I need to call on elders to hold the gathering in worship as we review and as we recall the lessons of the desert. The elders that I would like to call need not refrain from offering ministry if they are so compelled by the Spirit. Back in the early days of Friends, in the very first generation, women prophesied because the Spirit told them. Later on, when the Society of Friends started to acquire their good order and their business sense, the Friends gave a lot of responsibilities to women through the women's meetings. And at that point, they started using a name for the role of women and the power of the Spirit working through the women. And they called them mothers in Israel. I will ask Carol Edmonds from Monteverde Friends, Holly Baldwin, and Dorothy Henderson to please pray for the gathering, for those of us here, and for whatever messages may rise as we close our Bible study. Thank you, friends. Before we have a great people gather, let's say at a gathering, we have to have a vision of a great people to be gathered. I always pause when I realize that what George Fox saw from Pendle Hill was not a great people gathered. It was a great people to be gathered. When Moses went up his last hill, he was able to look at the land into which he was not allowed to go in. Only the people would go in, and only those who had been born in the desert during the 40 years of wonder. Only two were young when they left Egypt were allowed in. We won't say much about those two, because in our present condition, those two are very explicit leaders of an occupation of land, which in the text is often represented as somebody else's land. I'm speaking to you from the shores of the Tawanatset, which is a little river in Western Massachusetts. You won't find that name in any map. I found that name in the deed of sale of the lands of Hatley and what became later Amherst, named after a prominent genocidal military leader. That's where I live. And I am in the land of the Nunata people. And yet I have refrained from sharing with you my land recognition until now, when I can call you to a different kind of land recognition. I'd like you to think of Moses on top of this hill, explicitly punished to see this land into which he's not going to go in. The strength of that punishment in my condition today spells something quite contusive and quite conclusive. The promise is not the land. Anybody's land can never be anybody's promise. So the promise has to be something else. The promise may be just the promise. And what we're called to and what we're given is just the promise, and perhaps not the arrival. Definitely not the land. Definitely not title to it. A great people to be gathered has to be gathered in a promise that does not include anybody's land. But according to George Fox, the people is not so much gathered already as to be gathered. So what's up with that? None of the old folks, none of those who left Egypt, none of those who signed on to that covenant initially were allowed to move into the promise. And yet those people birthed it, created, made, the young people, the ones by definition under 40 who would come to the promise and who would be the people. Let us forgive each other for not talking today about the land. I wonder how many of you will recognize the source of this wording. This is the desert. It is not the whole desert. It's only part of the desert. need parts of the desert in our classroom because so many important things happen there. We need parts of the desert in the life of our children, in the life of the future of the society, friends, because so many important things happen in them. Friends, we are an aging people. In the materials of Godly Play, whenever you want to do the desert, you always have to think about what you're going to do with that mess of sand that you're going to carry or that you're going to put into the shelves. And it's always trouble. Big boxes, the sand lots, or however you want to do it, it's always a mess. The cleanest and most portable of devices has turned out to be this sack with 4 handles that deploys beautifully, allows the presenter of the Godly Play, sand and desert, to play with the reality of the sand and to really let the sand seep into the children. Upside down question marks are a mannerism. I use it shamelessly as I write in English. In a Quaker context, an upside down question mark that comes from the Spanish graphic tradition tells me that queries are supposed to turn us upside down. And inside of the queries, I want you to feel the echo of what's rewritten for this time, for our condition, for our study. Are you a child of the desert? Hast thou walked in the desert, and what thou speakest, is it inwardly from the desert? Sometimes we have to let the light yield to the desert. And there's no difference between the lessons of the light and the lessons of the desert when the desert and the light are one. I want to go back to the certainty in my heart right now that the land is never the promise. I work with my elders in 2 moments in the day. And one of my elders has had a leading, or he has heard words he had to put in poetry. And I want you to notice to what extent he has taken this Guatemalan hammock, which I bought on my while traveling in ministry, and made it an image of how we can be supported in God's hand. And I would add, supported without land under us. Oh, how to feel how firmly we are held in the hammock of God. There's no need to wait for a sweet chariot to swing low to carry us home. We sway to the joyful realization that even as our journey through the desert continues, in the promised land of our abiding hammock, already we are home. The thing that struck me is that the way that God would hold us as in a hammock has no land under it. It hangs. When Moses looks from the mountain, he looks at the land he cannot get into. When Fox looks from the mountain, he looks at the people to be gathered. How are we immersing our children in language that works, language, story, realizations that works for that of God in them to speak to them, for that of God in them to speak through them? There's a lot of things that remain in my bucket to say that we have not been given time for me to say. And I've been left, as we get ready to open up to listening to what we're told through those of us who will speak. I've been left with wondering about the people to be gathered. The people to be gathered under 40. The people who will continue our walk in the promise, to the promise, and to no land at all. How do we give the future of the Society of Friends language, story, sinew, fibers of the heart, resonance in the heart, for them to hear that of God in them, speaking to them and through them, both to the Society of Friends and beyond? What stories of Exodus are going to be stories of promise to move into an inclusivity, into a true universality? How will our universalist children learn to recognize the need for immersion in a language where they can speak to Quakers in Africa, to speak to Quakers in Latin America, where they're Quakers of color, with their own languages and their own biblical immersion in the stories? How will we teach the children to carry the lessons of the early friends. And lift them through rather than live through them. And live them in their condition. How will we prepare the people to be gathered? There is this desert, and it's not the whole desert. It's only part of the desert. We need parts of the desert in the heart of our children because so many important things happen there. And we need to figure out. We need to figure out how our exodus leads us to preparing the children for growth, preparing those who carry gifts for ministry, preparing those who carry ballast for eldership, preparing all of us for openness, for inclusion, for the blessings of coming into the promise that has no land underneath it. Are you a child of the desert? Hast thou walked in the desert? And what thou speakest, is it inwardly from the desert? Let us fall into worship and let the Spirit fly.